Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I will be talking to Heather R. Darsie about her brand new book on Katharine of Aragon. Her book is Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. I am not as simple as I may seem. Heather R. Darsie is an independent researcher specialising in early modern history. She describes herself as a Tudor-adjacent historian, focusing on the Holy Roman Empire and England in the early 16th century. She's the author of 4 non-fiction books: Anna, Duchess of Cleves, the King's Beloved Sister, Children of the House of Cleves, Anna and Her Siblings, Stuart Spouses, a compendium of consorts from James I of Scotland to Queen Anne of Great Britain, and Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. I am not as simple as I may seem. She self-published novella Diary of a Plague Doctor's Wife. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Heather. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm brilliant, thank you. I'm so excited for today's episode because we are discussing your latest release on Queen Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today.
So before we get on to the subject matter of your book and Katharine, I thought we could discuss a little bit about yourself. And I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history?
I've always liked it a little bit, but I first really became interested in the 15th and 16th centuries probably right around 2008 or so. So it's been a little while now.
Um, so what was the inspiration for the book?
Well, I wanted to know more about Catherine of Aragon's family origin because I feel like frequently when we read about Henry VIII, it kind of goes back to the Wars of the Roses because we hear about how the marriage of Henry's parents, Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, resolved that issue, and that had been an issue that realistically started much earlier on, the beginning of the 15th century. And then you have this wonderful, gorgeous Spanish princess coming into England. She has a bit of a rocky start because Henry's older brother Arthur dies, and that's all you really hear about Catherine. And as an American, we don't know a whole lot about Catherine's parents. We are familiar with them because with the history of Christopher Columbus being sent out to go exploring, when I was a child, we were taught about Christopher Columbus discovering America. Of course, history's been updated since then, but so we do hear about Isabel and Ferdinand, Catherine of Aragon's parents. And so I thought, well, what else should we know about them? So that's what inspired me to want to know more about Catherine and write a book about Catherine's family origins and how that might have impacted her in England. And also, I wanted to know more and hopefully bring that information to other people about what was happening to Catherine between the time when Arthur Tudor died and when she married Henry VIII, because I feel like it gets very much shortened into Henry VII was a miser, Ferdinand II, her father, was a jerk, and Catherine was poor. And that seemed a little bit too simple for me.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, I've getting through your book slowly but surely, but I think it does seem to be a case of, especially when Arthur dies, that it's Ferdinand doesn't want to give the money. Henry VII is trying to keep on to the money and earn a bit more money, and Catherine's stuck in limbo.
Yeah, I feel like that's been the story so far, but when you really look at it, it just was a poorly negotiated wedding contract in the sense that nobody really thought about what would happen if Arthur died right away, which I think also belies the issue that a lot of it's frequently been repeated in the past that Arthur was a sickly child. And so I think that his death was shocking to everyone because I think had it been in any way relayed to Catherine of Aragon's parents that Arthur was sickly, they would have negotiated the contract differently. So there was this idea that half of the dowry would be paid when Catherine got there and upon the marriage, and the other half would be paid once the marriage was consummated. And so if Arthur passed away and there was no proof that the marriage was consummated, and the best proof is pregnancy, uh, then Catherine's parents wouldn't have to pay the other half of the dowry. So that's where part of that initial issue of consummation comes from. And in my opinion, that was a very poorly written contract. And then you have other issues where the items that Catherine took with her, which were not money to pay for this dowry, were worth a certain amount of money or had a certain value in Spain. But then when they were taken to England, they did not have the same value. I mean, we have the same issues today. American money is not worth the same as British pounds. I mean, the pound is worth more than the dollar. And same idea, just different time period. And when Catherine's parents were negotiating this or preparing materials for her, or their courtiers were preparing materials for Catherine to take to England, they did not provide her with sufficient materials to fulfill the dowry. So there's also that issue. And on top of that, if I may I keep going?
Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
Um, and then on top of that, going back to this idea or this myth that Catherine's father is a miser, we have to remember that most of, if not all of the dowry was actually being paid out of the Castilian treasury, meaning her mother's treasury, and her mother dies while they're arguing over what's supposed to happen to the second half of the dowry money. And that means that Juana of Castile is the one who's actually in charge of the dowry, and she's in Flanders when their mother dies. And whatever anyone wants to think about Juana's mental condition, I don't think that she was mad. We can discuss that more if you want to, or there's actually pretty large chunk about my theory concerning Juana in the book. But whatever we want to think about Juana, regardless, she was in Flanders when their mother died, and so she was not available to come to Castile to do anything with the treasury. Ferdinand wasn't really available to do anything with the treasury, and when you get down to it, there wasn't really anything available to send for Catherine's dowry from the Castilian treasury. So when you really break it down, Ferdinand wasn't just being a jerk who didn't care about Catherine. There was a multiplicity of issues surrounding how, first of all, when and if the second part of the dowry should be paid, which could then play into Catherine's ability to marry later on. And that included marrying the future Henry VIII. The issue of how was the money or the items that were brought from Spain valued, and then the issue of accessing further materials or further items or just cash from the Castilian treasury because Isabella died and they didn't have anything in there, and Juana was not available to distribute any monies from Castile, and Ferdinand wasn't allowed to do it. So I think that that kind of changes, or I hope that that would change things a little bit as far as how we look at Ferdinand. And that was part of what I was interested in finding out. And I go into a lot more detail about it in my book, but that was part of why I wanted to write this and find out, well, what is really going on?
Yeah, it seems like there was a lot more going on underneath the surface than it's just as simple as two men being a bit of a jerk and that's it. I think it's as you say, a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. I hope that that comes across too. And I feel like with Henry VII, I think that he was doing the best that he could. And with the idea that he was a bit of a miser towards Catherine, I think that her being abandoned, trapped, whatever you will, at the English court for 7 years was extraordinary. Sometimes Isabella and Ferdinand, while Isabella was still alive, and certainly Ferdinand, would say, "Hey, Henry, Margaret of Austria and Henry, of course, being Henry the Seventh, whom you have tried to marry yourself, when she was abandoned at our court because our son, who was her husband, died, we treated her wonderfully, like she was our own daughter, and we did not do anything bad to her, treat her poorly. Well, she wasn't trapped at their court for 7 years. She was there for, I think it was about 18 months, maybe a little bit less. And she was also pregnant while she was there. And of course, she unfortunately had a stillborn daughter after the death of her husband. But that's a lot different than being stuck somewhere for 7 years. So, and Henry, from the documents that we do have that do exist, he did try to be kind to Catherine and polite to her, but it was a very difficult diplomatic situation. I mean, he has someone else's single teenage princess under his roof, and he has his own young son, and she's just stuck there. And it was a huge mess for Catherine and for Catherine's father and for Henry the Seventh, quite frankly. But I don't know that it's fair to characterize him as a miser either. I mean, it seemed like the whole incident, that whole 7 year span, was just a series of poorly planned diplomatic incidents and crises, like one crisis after another, combined with Henry the Seventh being overly pragmatic about the valuation of money. And also, he wouldn't want to, perhaps one can understand why he wouldn't want to give up half of a dowry that he should be receiving, because why would he agree that the marriage wasn't consummated when he's got so much money on the line? So I think when you sit back and really look at it and think about it practically rather than in just bare bones terms of, oh, Henry the Seventh was mean, it makes a little bit more sense why things went the way that they did. Still very unfortunate for Catherine of Aragon. I don't think that changes. I don't think the series of events changes the fact that it was very, very upsetting for Catherine to be effectively abandoned in England for such a long time without knowing what her future was and being jerked around so much. But as far as how Ferdinand and Henry the Seventh behaved, might make a little more sense. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it might make a little more sense of why it happened.
What was the most fascinating thing that you found or you really enjoyed learning about when you were researching for this book?
How wild Catherine of Aragon's family history was. I thought that the English were a bit outrageous until I started learning about the Spanish.
I mean, I'm I was a bit shocked when I was been reading about it. It's just like, wow, there's no bets in this court. It's cards off.
Yes, yes. Um, just even just going back to her paternal grandfather, he was absolutely vicious towards his children. He had no problem with them mysteriously getting dead so that he could have property that he wanted to have. I think that his behavior explains some of the behavior of Catherine's own father towards her sister Juana, and maybe even of Catherine's nephew Charles V, of his ongoing behavior towards Juana. It's it's absolutely extraordinary. I don't want to get into all those details there, but it I think it's fair to say if someone were to read the book, you would be surprised. But I would like to talk a little bit about the founding of the family dynasty because I think that it can explain what happened or maybe what could have been going through Catherine's mind when Henry Fitzroy was born. So could we maybe go in that direction?
Yes, of course.
So the Trastamara dynasty was founded by an illegitimate son. And this is one of those times I get to use a naughty word, but it's historically correct. He was known to history initially as Henry the Bastard, and his legitimate brother came to be known as Peter the Cruel. Henry the Bastard was one of multiple children. He was actually an identical twin. In Spanish, his name is Enrique, and his brother was Fadrique, I think is how you pronounce it. And they were Henry and his twin brother were the identical twin sons of their father's favorite mistress. He had multiple children with this mistress, and Pedro was the only surviving son of their father's queen. And there was a lot of tension and a lot of animosity from the queen towards the mistress, especially because the queen had very little political power or might at court. Most of that was granted to, or people socially and overtly gravitated towards the mistress because it was very obvious who the king favored. So when the king died, there was a campaign between the now Queen Dowager and the new King Pedro the Cruel, or Peter the Cruel, towards getting rid of this mistress and killing her, which they succeed in doing. Henry the Bastard clearly does not like this. And so he begins his own campaign against Peter the Cruel. And Peter the Cruel is a whole nother mess on his own. And again, lots of details in the book, but he is a bit of a hypocrite in his own right, with, of course, going after the mistress that ousted his mother, but then kind of doing something very, very similar, but a little bit more twisted later on in his life. And at one point, the English get kind of roped into the Castilian excitement. And one of Peter the Cruel's, actually both of Peter the Cruel, two of Peter the Cruel's daughters, because he had three, but a third one kind of disappears, wind up marrying into the English nobility. And that's how we get Catherine of Lancaster, whose mother is, I believe, Constance of Castile. So Henry winds up murdering Peter the Cruel after a lot of false starts. Henry gets on the throne, Henry gets off the throne, then Henry murders Peter. Henry's firmly on the throne, and then one of Henry's children winds up marrying Catherine of Lancaster. That is how we get the English nobility and the English bloodlines into the Spanish royal families. But and that's just the founding of the family dynasty. That doesn't even get into Henry's own descendants and first of all, all the intermarrying amongst the cousins. And then after that, just the back and forth between them, because throughout the 14th century, when all this is happening, so the end of the 14th century, all of the 15th century, and then going into the very, very early parts of the 16th century, you have this idea of removing the Iberian Peninsula from control of Islamic influence. And on top of that, you have this idea of trying to unify all the Spains, because Spain at this time is multiple different smaller kingdoms and territories, and then it's split up underneath different crowns, which we can talk about if you'd like. And then you also have Portugal and Navarre, and trying to unite all of these things together. And so Henry the Bastard, who then becomes known as Henry the Fratricidal for killing his brother Peter the Cruel, his descendants just spend the next couple centuries trying to do everything that they can to take over, oust the Islamic influence, and marry in such a way that they can just totally have absolute dominion over the Iberian Peninsula. They don't quite get there. They get very, very close through Catherine of Aragon's sisters by the end of the 15th century, but they don't ever quite control it all.
I mean, it's just, I mean, Henry the Fratricidal, I was wowed by him, his prowess in
Yeah.
politics.
Yeah, he went a little nuts there, but he did it. And one other things I thought that I would bring up, or that could be interesting, is that at the time, identical twins were considered to be bad luck.
Oh,
So, and it's not the first time in Catherine of Aragon's family that we see identical twins be born, but I thought that that was interesting as well when I learned that, is that that could have been an oh no omen, if you will, at court when the king's mistress has a set of identical twins at around the same time that the king's queen has a legitimate son. So, but let's bring up then, or let's talk about why Catherine of Aragon, if she knew about this, maybe we can see how when we have Princess Mary born, and then within a year and a half, Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son of the king, is born. And Mary's a girl, and that is Catherine's only surviving child. Mary, of course, I know that she has this unfortunate epithet of being Bloody Mary. I do not think that that is accurate, but let's set that aside for now because Catherine had no way of predicting in 1518 when Henry Fitzroy was born what was going to happen by 1533. So let's set that aside for a moment. But if we are thinking about Catherine in the mid to late 1520s, the Anne Boleyn mess, we know that Henry Fitzroy exists. What could happen to poor Princess Mary if Mary comes to the throne as Queen Regnant, which in Catherine's mind is perfectly reasonable, we have to assume, because her mother is the Queen Regnant. Isabella is not the first Queen Regnant of anything in Spain. In fact, they're all descended from Urraca the Reckless, who is the first empress of all the Spains and the first European Queen Regnant ever. So the idea of having queens regnant is not strange or outlandish to Catherine. So if Catherine thinks, okay, great, we have our heir, we have Mary, she's wonderful, Mary gets on the throne, Catherine could have very easily had serious, recognizable concern and anxiety that, oh no, here's Henry Fitzroy. Oh no, it's 1524. He's being recognized as legitimate, because that's very similar to what happened with Henry the Fratricidal, who, kills his legitimate brother and becomes king of Castile and Leon. So I, when I was looking at the origins of Catherine's family dynasty again, I thought that was kind of setting off alarm bells for me. And we don't know if Catherine knew that that's how her family dynasty was founded. We also don't know if she didn't know that. It might have had a more romantic spin to it. I would assume that if she did know that there could have been something about Peter the Cruel being as terrible as he was. He did do some really nasty things, by the way. But Peter the Cruel is terrible, and so Henry the Fratricidal had to come in and save the day for Castile and Leon. So there could have been an air of romance to what he did, as history does. But still, she could have had that idea in her mind when Henry Fitzroy was born, and that might help explain some of the reasons why she was just so resistant to Henry VIII's idea, aside of ending their marriage, aside from the idea that it was ridiculous. Like, I think that that helps make more sense of why Catherine was behaving as she did.
No, yeah, I mean, I didn't really think of it like that, but I guess if she did know, because obviously, as you say, we can't be certain that she did or didn't know about her ancestors, you would be worried because obviously, when you look at the 1520s and Henry Fitzroy's getting all these titles, it is like, is Mary going to be discarded? And it's like, it is worrying.
And another thing we have to look at is if Catherine knew anything about her paternal grandfather, John the Second of Aragon. John the Second of Aragon sent his legitimate daughter, Blanche, who was Queen Regnant of Navarre, had her locked up, stole Navarre from her. Henry VIII sends Mary off to Ludlow Castle in, I believe it was 1525, which, by the way, is normal behavior. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent about that. In in 1525, and I believe it is 1525, might have been 1524, so please don't come after me if I get my years slightly off. It was around 1525. Young Mary is betrothed to Catherine's nephew, Charles V, who is a 24 or 25-year-old man. He's wanting to have his cousin so he can marry her. Mary is a child. She has not been invested as the Princess of Wales, but that's kind of where this is going. She is for all intents and purposes the heir to the English throne. Place where the heirs to the English throne go to learn how to administer a kingdom is Ludlow. That was an appropriate thing to happen for someone who is probably going to become the next monarch in England. I just wanted to point that out. Now, Catherine might have been upset for several reasons. She clearly had bad memories connected to Ludlow Castle. I don't think anybody can dispute that. Arthur died there. Catherine doesn't like Ludlow Castle. Makes sense. But also, Catherine's grandfather, John the Second of Aragon, had his daughter Blanche, who was the Queen Regnant of Navarre, locked up somewhere, and she conveniently died. So, and at that time, Catherine's sister Juana had been locked up for about a decade, initially by their father, and at this point was under continued confinement by Catherine's nephew Juana's son, Charles V. So again, when we're looking at this family history and not in the super distant past, there are a lot of really interesting things that Catherine probably knew something about. So she never met her Aunt Blanche because her Aunt Blanche came from the first wife of John II of Aragon, and her father came from the second marriage. So, but she might have heard of Aunt Blanche, possibly. So if she knew anything about that, though, that might have been, and again, we don't know if she did or not, but if she did, that might have been something that kind of set off some alarm bells for her if she or caused some anxiety for her of, oh no, my daughter's being sent away. And initially this seems okay because this is where the people who are heirs to the English throne go to learn how to administer the kingdom. But there's also Henry Fitzroy, who's the illegitimate son. And uh-oh, here's Anne Boleyn. What is going to happen to my child? So it kind of makes sense when or helps her life make more sense, I believe.
Yeah, I think it kind of shows Catherine's personality almost and what kind of her beliefs and what she would have been brought up in because obviously 1525 and everything is starting to change. As you say, Anne Boleyn enters stage left, Henry Fitzroy stage right, and it's her and Mary in the middle. And I think it's a bomb was about to be set off in the 1525 onwards.
Yep, absolutely.
So you were saying that Catherine of Aragon's grandfather was not particularly kind to his children, and I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about him and why he's not very kind.
John II lived for a very long time, so I wanted to point that out first. He had two different wives. The first one was Blanche the First of Navarre, and he had three children with her that survived. He had a son and two daughters. And the son, caveat or tangent, I have to go into this because, as we all know, I love Anna of Cleves. He married Agnes of Cleves. The son married Agnes of Cleves. They didn't have any children together. But that particular relative of Anna of Cleves, or was just a relative of Anna of Cleves, and I just like pointing that out. So anyway, so he marries Agnes of Cleves, and when Blanche the First of Navarre passes away, rather than just immediately handing over the territory to their son Charles, John II, who is the King Euryxorus, so by the right of the wife of Navarre, um, Blanche the First updated her will with a codicil, which is like an amendment, to say, I would just like my husband John, who I love so much, to kind of be like a steward of Navarre for Charles, for our wonderful son Charles. And John said, or John took this to mean that he was just going to be king. And so he didn't really hand over the reins to Charles, and Charles, Prince of Viana, was young, and he was married, but he was young, and so it was kind of okay for a little bit, and then it became increasingly not okay. So then you have some civil wars happening, and off and on, John, and I'm truncating this quite a bit because it's a podcast. Please go read the book. It is very interesting. I think, and I hope that you will find my writing of it interesting as well. But so there's some warring going back and forth and some imprisonment of Charles. And at the end, there's an unsteady peace between Charles and John II of Aragon. Again, this is Catherine of Aragon's paternal grandfather. And then Charles winds up dead. And he's young. He's maybe, I think, 28 when he dies. Nobody really knows why he died. And usually around this time, if somebody died for mysterious reasons, poison was suspected. Poison was that great killer of people. And I don't think that poisonings suddenly decreased as time wore on. I think that we just have so many more advances in medicine now that we can detect things like cancer or genetic anomalies that would have led to much younger deaths back then and that we can catch now and treat. So he died of something that was not poison, but everyone said it was poison because look at what his dad was doing. So Charles gets dead. That causes some issues because by this point, Ferdinand II of Aragon, he's about 8 or 9 years old, and his mother is just doing everything she can to stick her foot in it and try and make Charles the second, or excuse me, Ferdinand II of Aragon, who is now the heir to Aragon, because Charles of Viana is dead, more important. Nobody really likes this. But going back to what Catherine of Aragon's paternal grandfather was doing, John II of Aragon, um, he then, so the territory of Navarre then passes on to Blanche the Second of Navarre, per the will and also per what Charles wanted, because Agnes of Cleves dies in the interim between when Blanche the First of Navarre dies and when her husband, when Agnes's husband Charles of Viana dies. So, and they died without having any children. So Blanche the Second now becomes Queen Regnant of Navarre, and John doesn't like this. So he says to his youngest child, Eleanor, "Hey, you're married. You live in like the area that's kind of bordering France and Switzerland in modern 2025 terms. Can you and your husband just kind of steal Blanche the Second and imprison her for a while and maybe not feed her?" So that's what they do. And so Blanche the Second dies, and then that leaves, and Eleanor is not going to go against John the Second of Aragon, so he winds up kind of being King of Navarre. And then he and Eleanor wind up dying within days of each other. So Eleanor is the Queen of Navarre in her own right as Queen Regnant for a matter of days before she dies. And the territory never actually gets absorbed into Aragon. The whole plan just dies out with Eleanor. But wow, wow. So he maybe killed his son, definitely managed to get his daughter dead by manipulating or with the compliance of his other daughter. And that's Catherine of Aragon's grandpa, everyone. So it's just wow.
Don't mess with the dynasty.
I guess not. But these are all things that we don't know how much Catherine knew about. But if she even had a hint of any of this, and now she's in England, and we're coming out of the Wars of the Roses, and Henry's got Henry Fitzroy, and regardless of any other illegitimate children, who knows who there was? I mean, I know that we think that Catherine Carey was, and maybe her brother, and maybe Henry had 100 illegitimate children. Who knows? But we know there was definitely one, and that one was acknowledged, and that one was a threat. And then we see all the other goofy stuff that's going on. I mean, these were serious problems that Catherine might have had in her mind, and when she was in England, that she could have been thinking about.
Obviously, Catherine's parents, Isabel and Ferdinand, were quite the powerhouse, and we remember them for being that. How did they come to the throne? Was it easy to kind of get the throne of Spain?
Had the crown of Aragon, which um, Catherine's father had, and then you had the crown of Castile and Leon, which was the disputed territory. And what I mean by the crown, again, this is kind of trying to break it down in an easily understandable way. So let's think about the United Kingdom, right? So in the United Kingdom, you have Wales, you have England, you have Scotland, and you have Northern Ireland. The crown of Castile and Leon is kind of like that, as is the Crown of Aragon. So it's kingdoms and territories that are distinct political entities, but they are unified to a degree underneath one overarching political body. So Ferdinand is the head of the Crown of Aragon. But for Isabella, she has an older half brother, Henry IV of Castile and Leon. He's the king. Isabella and her brother are the children from a second marriage from John II of Castile and Leon and his wife Isabella. There's lots of Isabellas happening in this time period, and I actually use multi. I think I use Elizabeth and a bunch of different names during this time period in the book. Another quick tangent. The names Isabel, Isabeau, Isabella, Elizabeth, Erzsébet, those are all the same name, just in different languages. So if you're reading my book and you're like, why is she using all these different names? It's because there's so many Isabels and Isabellas. Um, so needless to say, I believe that Isabella of Castile and Leon was named after her mother or possibly her grandmother because they all had the same name. But Isabella's of Castile and Leon, Catherine of Aragon's mother, her brother Henry the Fourth, so Catherine of Aragon's uncle, or realistically half uncle, was had a very weak personality. He probably would have been better off being a second son and living a clerical life, living a life in a monastery. He was not super interested in being a king. His first wife, who Blanche II of Navarre, who marries John II of Aragon and has a horrible life, never consummate or never has a child with his first wife. And so they have the marriage annulled. It's believed that the marriage is cursed. That's why they never have a baby. So then he marries his second wife, Joan of Portugal, and they take a while to have a baby, and they finally have a baby, and it's a little girl, Juana, but we'll call her Joanna. And almost immediately, there's rumors that Joanna is not her father's daughter. And Joanna's mother does nothing to help this because boy, does she love a good affair. So she has love affairs. It's very overt, it's very out in the open to the point where she gets locked up in a castle, has an affair with a guard there, and has identical twin sons. So there's our second set of identical twin sons, which are bad luck. They don't really interfere with Catherine of Aragon's family beyond the fact that Joanna's mother does nothing to help her daughter Joanna. So you have Henry IV of Castile and Leon. He's a weak ruler. He keeps going back and forth on the legitimacy of his only child, which is a girl, and she can rule on her own. That's fine. But at the same time, you have his younger half sister Isabella and her brother, and the nobles don't really like Henry IV. So there is a coup stage where they try to put Isabella's elder brother, actually, he was a younger brother, excuse me, younger brother on the throne. It kind of works, but not totally. And then the brother dies. So that leaves Isabella. For a few years, it goes back and forth with Henry IV saying, okay, Isabella, you can be the heir. Joanna's not really my daughter. And then, well, I guess Joanna is my daughter, so never mind Isabella. And then, well, yeah, Isabella, you can be the heir. But no, 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 I really want my daughter Joanna to be, she's my daughter now. I think she's my daughter. So it just kind of goes back and forth like this for a while. And he also demands of Isabella that she not marry Ferdinand, or at the very least that he is allowed to pick her husband so he can make a marriage that's advantageous for him. Well, she doesn't listen and she marries her cousin Ferdinand. Interestingly, with a forged dispensation.
Hmm.
They didn't actually have permission from the Pope to marry. So that's fun too. So she marries Ferdinand II when she wasn't supposed to for multiple reasons. And they have a child. And then Henry IV dies. Not everyone really wants 12-year-old disputed legitimacy Joanna to become the next monarch of Castile and Leon when you have Isabella, who is an adult, who is married, and who has a child. So civil war breaks out. Joanna winds up marrying the very elderly by 15th century standards, but certainly much older than her, King of Portugal. And they go back and forth. And effectively, to really shorten it up, because I'm kind of going on at this point, Isabella and Ferdinand win. Joanna is abandoned by her husband and is just locked up for the rest of her life and does not die until the 1520s.
Poor Joanna.
Yeah, the 1520s.
Poor Joanna.
Yeah. So that's also happening. So Catherine of Aragon, when she's in England, Joanna, the woman from whom her parents stole the Castilian throne, is still alive, okay? In Portugal. She's still alive. And Henry Fitzroy's alive. Catherine's only child is a daughter, and then she has all this messed up family history. So there's a lot of things that Catherine could have been aware of that could have caused her some anxiety by the mid 1520s when her husband Henry VIII was starting to get a bit goofy on her, if you will.
You mentioned earlier that you had some theories about Joanna, Catherine of Aragon's sister, and how Ferdinand of Aragon treated her. Do you want to maybe expand on that?
Yes. So with Juana of Castile, I like to call her Juana. I like to call her by her Spanish name. Also, I call her that in the book because it helps distinguish her from Joanna, after whom she could have been named. When we look at Juana and we look at her behavior, some of what we have to keep in mind, and I go into several behaviors of which she's accused of being weird or strange or whatever it is in the book. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Um, we have to look at what else was going on around her. So one of the biggest things is that she was being weird over the corpse of her husband, who does unfortunately pass away shortly after they make some progress, return to Spain and make some progress with her and him, quite frankly, being established on the Castilian throne. And Juana is seen transporting his corpse to Granada, which is what he wanted, where he wanted to be buried. And that's kind of on the southern side of the peninsula, and they're kind of on the northern side. So this is a pretty big journey. They're traveling only at night. Juana was pregnant with her last child, Catherine, when Philip the Handsome died, when her husband Philip died. And by the time they're done squabbling over who's going to actually be ruling or administering, if you will, Castile, we're getting on towards Christmas time. Catherine's really pregnant. She doesn't want to travel during the day. She wants to travel at night. They're chanting and it's candlelit and it's looking real weird, right? Well, she didn't think that the people of Castile wanted to see their queen that way. So someone who either was close to giving birth or had just given birth, depending on the timing of it, in mourning, trying to transport a corpse that neither Catherine's, or excuse me, Juana's father nor Philip's father had any interest in getting buried. So everyone else is busy arguing over the kingdom, while Juana's just trying to bury her husband and honor his last wishes. But people just point to the fact that she was being goofy and trying to transport it at night. She had no help transporting it. So she was trying to be practical, I think. And this isn't the best example, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit shorter. But there were some other things that she did when we really, really look at it. s- At when you strip away some of the things, seem to be logical in a simple way, simplistically logical. Well, if you tell me that Y won't happen so long as X is going on, then I'm going to continue to do X so that Y doesn't happen. So it got me thinking. One thing that's wonderful about the time that we live in now is we're able to recognize that there are a lot of people who are neurodivergent. Now, I would say, and any historian worth their salt would say, it is extremely dangerous and usually quite foolish to diagnose someone with mental disease, which neurodivergence is not a disease, but with mental disease, and lots of historians have diagnosed Juana with mental disease. It is also foolish to try and give specific attributes to people who have died 500 years ago without having a wealth of information that's unbiased. And so giving the attribute of neurodivergence to Juana can potentially be going out on a limb. I did choose to go out on such a limb, and I'm just wondering if she was neurodivergent because I don't know that we've really talked about that in history before. And then there are a couple other people and some of her descendants that when I really look at their behavior, I'm wondering if that's kind of what we're seeing. And I have no training in the field of psychology. I don't know. I've read a lot about it. I think we've all encountered people and had our own experiences with people. But it's not like this is something that just cropped up in the last 25 years. We're just much better at understanding that that's what we're seeing and understanding our family and friends more who have their own neurodivergent experiences. But I'm wondering if that's what was going on with her and if that was being weaponized against her. I don't know. We can't ever know But looking at it between that and her being a woman, kind of wondering if that was what was going on with Juana of Castile.
Yeah, I think Juana is often called the Mad Queen, and I think maybe she's not understood because I think we kind of judge her on her actions or what she might have done when Philip dies, not before.
Well, and also there's this idea that she flew into these rages because he was having affairs. Well, if we're being extremely simplistically logical, you're married, you don't do that. And then you have um I hope I'll be forgiven if this isn't the best term, but then you have a meltdown because the logic's malfunctioning because your husband's cheating on you. I mean, I think there are some things there that could cause us to maybe reconsider what was going on with Juana. And I hope I get a chance and maybe I'm equipped to have the chance to maybe write a biography about her at some point. We'll see if I'm equipped and able and have the opportunity to do that. But aside from that, I really like it and I really hope that we can stop calling her Juana the Mad because I don't think she was crazy. I don't think that, she's been accused of being schizophrenic and all sorts of horrible things. I don't think that that's what was going on. Again, I'm not a psychologist, and like we said, or like we've been discussing, it's really foolish and dangerous to try and diagnose somebody with mental illness. First of all, not as a professional, and secondly, not 500 years later. But I don't know that she was mentally ill. She could have just had a different mind than the majority.
I mean, no, I agree. Obviously, it can be dangerous to kind of examine people from 500 years ago and go, oh yeah, they've got this or this situation happened. Like we sometimes talk about Catherine Howard and her teenage years, and obviously it can be dangerous in 2025 to discuss that because obviously it's hard to put a mental illness on someone, a situation or event on them. But I think Juana is quite misunderstood because I've read a little bit about her and I think she doesn't seem to have had the best time growing up either.
Mm-mm. I don't think any of them really did, to be honest. And I feel like with the princesses, surprisingly to a lesser degree, Juana, but I feel like Isabella, so the oldest daughter. So there were four daughters and one son. So there was Isabella and Juana, Juan or John, Catherine and Maria. Catherine was the youngest. I feel like especially Maria, Catherine, and Isabella were just very much the stereotypical pawns on the British, or excuse me, not British, European marriage market. So Isabella's first husband dies, and they immediately find another husband for her. And then when Isabella dies, Maria marries the same guy. So it's just, and then, poor Catherine, her first husband dies. She gets stuck in England so that she can marry the next English prince. So, what happened to Juana as the queen regnant is tragic, but at least marriage-wise, she just had to get married once. She wasn't getting passed around. So, but yeah, I feel like I think I hope everyone can agree that she's very misunderstood.
What if you had to recommend your book to someone, what would you say about your book and why people should read it?
I think that people who are I'll tell you the interest that someone should have who would want to read it. I think people who are interested in medieval European history, particularly Spanish history, would enjoy my book, or that would be my hope. And people who are interested in knowing more about Catherine of Aragon specifically and how that history would have impacted her, and perhaps how she thought or how she viewed the world, and also Mary. I think that if Mary knew her family history, which I believe Catherine would have imparted to her, that book would be important to them, to a reader as well.
Oh sorry, have you got any more books lined up?
Boy, do I. I have a book on Anne Boleyn coming out. Hopefully, that should be released in the UK in December 2025. That book is a little bit different. As I think most people are aware, my primary career is as an attorney. And so I've taken on Anne Boleyn's case, if you will, to see what I'm able to defend versus what I'm able to prosecute and figure out why she really had to die, if you will. And it doesn't change. the general reasoning behind what happened, but I hope it helps fill in the gaps a bit more of why she met the fate that she did or why Henry believed that she had to meet the fate that she did. And then after that, I have Habsburg sisters, so about Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor's sisters.
I mean, they both sound really exciting, but bring on December 2025.
Yeah, I think well the Habsburg one that'll be out in 26, late 26, early 27. So
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
I do, and I don't know that this directly answers it, but I don't like it when when a person calls an individual from history a historical character. They're historical figures because they're people who lived, breathed, loved, hated, cried, laughed, and died. They're not characters, they're people, they're figures. So when we talk about people from history, we should talk about them as figures or persons and not as characters. So that is, I suppose, my historical pet peeve. Otherwise, anything about Anne of Cleves being ugly and getting dumped by Henry VIII, that's all just rubbish. We need to stop that. I've got some great books. I've got two really good books I can recommend to you about why that's incorrect.
If you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when and where would it be and why?
I would I would want to see the first meeting of Henry VIII and Anna of Cleves because again, I understand that there's the English story that was made up for the annulment, but when you look at the German record, shameless self-plug here. Please, please, if you have not read these books already, please read My Anna, Duchess of Cleves, the King's beloved sister, and Children of the House of Cleves, Anna and her siblings. It goes into the German records. They are the only books written from the German perspective about Anna, and all of those records were written at or shortly after the events surrounding Anna's marriage and annulment occurred, whereas all the English records were written specifically so Henry could have an annulment. So let's please read those. But when you look at the German account, there was Henry appearing in disguise. There was a slight misunderstanding. There was no Henry flying off in a rage. They actually got along quite well. I also would assume that Anna kind of figured out that the dude who was roughly 50 years old and who was super tall was probably her husband, that everyone else acted slightly afraid of. She probably figured it out. And there might have been a portrait of him at the Exchequer in Calais. Who knows? So maybe she recognized him from that. But I would have liked to have seen them because they did get along that evening. He gave her some gifts. He gave her a crystal goblet and he gave her a chain of pearls. And they got along well enough that he came back the next morning and had breakfast with her. So I would have liked to have seen that evening, I suppose, and the next morning.
Have you got a favorite historical book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
I don't know if this is on point, but I really like rereading. There's four books I really like to read, and I know you said one, but I'm hoping you'll allow me four. I like reading the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. I like reading Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, um, Machiavelli's The Prince, and Castiglione's The Courtier. I read those books every couple of years because the way that I interpret them changes every couple of years, and I think they help me keep perspective on my life.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Oh, Anna of Cleves, she's got to be a hoot.
I'd love to meet her.
I genuinely, I do think she would have been fun. I think she would have been a good time. I think she was sassy. Um, from what I can tell, I would have liked to have met her. I'm
Have
sorry.
you got a favorite historical building?
You know what? I'm going to tell you about the building I work in. And it is not historical by non-US standards, but it's historical in the United States. I get to work in a courthouse that was built in the very early 20th century, and I absolutely love it. I have the honor of doing that because it's very common that as the centuries or the decades at this point, it's not centuries, but as the decades have worn on, that usually courthouses, the historic courthouses in the United States, are turned into administrative buildings, so the general public is not able to go into them anymore, and they're not used as courthouses anymore. But where I work, there is very good conservation effort in the building, and when more courtrooms were needed, rather than shutting down the historic courthouse and building a new one, they hired very skilled architects who preserved the outer facade of the building and incorporated it into the extension um, for the new part of the building. So that is my favorite historic building because I get to go inside it every day and enjoy its beauty every day. And I'm very fortunate to work in that building.
I mean, that must be incredible to go there every day.
It is, as silly as it sounds. I mean, and it's not as stunning as a palace, right? I mean, there's some absolutely stunning buildings in Europe and even in the United States. There's some fabulous buildings that we have that are wonderfully maintained or have been lovingly restored, but it's very nice. And I feel very fortunate that I get to work somewhere that I get to go in this to me historic building that the local government was able to work together with a skilled architect so that the public can still go in it and enjoy it, and I just get to work in it. So that is my favorite building.
Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing your wonderful new book.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.